Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There is a particular kind of power that operates in the middle distance, not the power of armies in the field or kings on their thrones, but the quieter, more patient, more durable power of the person who holds the ledger, the person who knows who owes what to whom, the person whose signature is required before the campaign can be funded, or the cathedral can be built, or the cardinal can purchase his election. The person who sits at the centre of a web of obligations so dense and so intricately maintained that the entire political and cultural life of an age passes through it, transformed by the passage, leaving something behind each time. Tonight we're talking about a family that built exactly that kind of power, that maintained it across more than 3 centuries, that used it to finance the most celebrated explosion of art and thought in the history of Western civilization, that lost it and regained it, and lost it again in ways whose specific drama is as good as anything the period's novelists could have invented, and whose name has become so synonymous with the Renaissance that the two things are almost impossible to separate in the popular imagination. Tonight we're talking about the Medici. Not the Medici of the tourist photographs, the noble portraits and the famous faces that look down from the walls of the Uffizi Gallery, though those faces are here and we will spend time with them. Not the Medici as a symbol of Renaissance refinement, though the refinement was real and we will dwell on it. What I want to give you tonight is the full story. The banking mechanics and the political violence and the papal intrigue and the assassination attempt in a cathedral, and the family members who went mad and the family members who were murdered, and the ones who became Queen of France and the ones who died in exile, and the slow, complicated, occasionally glorious and occasionally squalid history of a family that was never quite royalty, and never quite anything else either, that kept reinventing itself across 3 centuries while Florence and Italy and the whole Western world changed around it. And we're going to end where the family's story effectively ends, in 1743, when the last Medici died without an heir, and the dynasty that had been accumulating and dispersing power since the 14th century was over. No looking forward from there. The story is rich enough without it. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Let the room go soft. The air in Florence in the 14th century is thick with the smell of wool and river water and the particular dusty warmth of a city that has been building itself for 1,000 years. Let your breath slow. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to the beginning of everything. To understand the Medici, you first have to understand Florence. And to understand Florence in the late medieval and early Renaissance period, you have to understand wool. It sounds unglamorous. It is the most important single fact about the city. Florence in the 13th and 14th centuries was the most important centre of the European wool trade, not because it produced wool. The raw material came primarily from England and Spain, but because it processed it. The Arte della Lana, the Wool Guild, organised the import of raw English wool, its cleaning, dyeing, weaving into finished cloth, and export as luxury textile to buyers across Europe and the Mediterranean world, in a production process that employed a significant fraction of the city's population and generated the capital that made everything else possible. The Arte di Calimala, the merchants' guild that handled the trade in foreign cloth, was the economic twin of the Wool Guild, and together they made Florence the most commercially sophisticated city in Europe, at a time when commerce was the primary engine of political and cultural power. Commerce of this scale required finance, and finance in the medieval world was a practice surrounded by theological and legal complications that made it, in its most sophisticated forms, necessarily a matter of ingenuity and institutional innovation. The Catholic Church's prohibition on usury, the charging of interest on loans, condemned as the sale of time which belonged to God, created a formal legal obstacle to the banking operations that commercial society obviously required. The Florentine merchant bankers who solved this problem were not defying the Church so much as navigating around its specific prohibitions with an inventiveness that the Church officially condemned and practically tolerated because the papacy itself needed banking services that the theology officially prohibited. The letter of exchange, the deposited capital, the various mechanisms by which profit on capital could be concealed within exchange rate, differentials and commercial margins and management fees rather than stated as interest. These were the instruments of Florentine financial innovation, and they transformed the economic life of medieval Europe as thoroughly as the physical infrastructure of the Roman roads had transformed it 1,000 years before. The Medici were not the inventors of these techniques. They were the greatest practitioners of a tradition that had been developing in Florence for several generations before Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici established the Medici Bank in 1397. The Bardi and Peruzzi families had been the dominant Florentine bankers of the mid-14th century, operating banking networks across Europe that dwarfed anything the Medici would build in their early decades. The Bardi and Peruzzi had extended to Edward III of England loans so large that when Edward defaulted in the 1340s, unable to repay the financing he had used to begin the 100 Years' War, both families effectively collapsed in the cascading financial crisis that followed. The lesson of the Bardi-Peruzzi failure was one that the Medici took seriously, and that shaped the organisational structure of the bank they built. No single borrower, however powerful, should be permitted to accumulate an obligation so large that its default could destroy the entire enterprise. Diversification of risk, distributed across many clients and many branches in many cities, was the structural principle that Giovanni di Bicci built into the Medici Bank from the beginning, and it was the principle that kept the bank alive for nearly a century after his death. The world that Giovanni di Bicci entered when he came of age in the second half of the 14th century was a Florentine commercial world that had survived one of the greatest catastrophes in European history and was in the process of reorganizing itself on terms that the catastrophe had made possible. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 had killed between a third and a half of Florence's population. The estimates vary, but the consensus is that the city went from something over 90,000 inhabitants before the plague to perhaps 50,000 or fewer in its aftermath, and the specific consequence of this demographic catastrophe for the commercial world was a profound restructuring of the labour market, the land market, and the structure of the guild system through which Florentine economic and political life was organised. The guilds, the Arte Maggiori and the Arte Minori, the major and minor guilds, were the institutional backbone of Florentine civic life, in a way that has no close modern parallel. They were simultaneously trade associations, mutual aid societies, political units, and religious fraternities. Membership in a major guild was a prerequisite for participation in Florentine political life, for holding the offices of the Republic, for being in the most fundamental sense a full citizen of the city. The Arte della Lana and the Arte di Calimala, the Wool Guild and the Cloth Merchants Guild, were the wealthiest and most politically powerful, and the men who led them were the effective governing class of the Florentine Republic, in a way that the formal constitutional arrangements partially concealed and partially expressed. The working population of the wool industry, the chompi, the wool carders and combers and dyers, who performed the manual labour that transformed raw English wool into finished Florentine cloth, occupied the bottom of this commercial hierarchy with a visibility and a restiveness that occasionally erupted into open political conflict. The Chompy Revolt of 1378, in which the wool workers seized power temporarily and attempted to gain guild recognition and political representation before being suppressed by a coalition of major guild merchants, was the most dramatic expression of the social tensions that the guild system contained, and that the Black Death had intensified by changing the relative scarcity of different kinds of labour. The banking community that operated alongside the guild world was formally organised through the Arte del Cambio, the Money Changers Guild, which in practice encompassed the much larger and more complex operations of the international merchant banking families, rather than merely the local currency exchange that the guild's name suggested. The men who managed letters of exchange between Florence and Rome and Bruges and London were operating at a level of financial sophistication that the Arte del Cambio's formal charter barely described. But the guild membership was the necessary credential and the regulatory framework within which the operations were conducted. Giovanni di Bici de' Medici is the foundational figure of Medici power, and he has the particular quality of the founding patriarch, the man whose specific combination of ability and restraint established the conditions for a later, more dramatic generation to flourish. He was born around 1360 into a family that was respectable, but not prominent in Florentine commercial and political life. The Medici had been guild members and occasionally office holders for several generations, but they were not among the great families of the city and had never dominated its politics. Giovanni entered the banking trade as a young man, worked in the Roman branch of a relative's banking house, developed his skills and his connections in the city where the papacy's financial needs were largest and most lucrative, and in 1397 established the Medici Bank as an independent enterprise headquartered in Florence, with a branch in Rome that handled the papacy's accounts. The Rome branch was the key to everything. The papacy in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was an institution of enormous financial complexity. It collected revenues from across Christendom in the form of fees, tithes, the sale of indulgences, the proceeds of appointments to church offices, and the various other mechanisms by which the medieval church monetized its spiritual authority. And it needed banking services of considerable sophistication to manage those revenues across multiple currencies and multiple jurisdictions. The Florentine banking houses that served as the papacy's bankers, and the Medici were not the first, were in a position analogous to that of the central bank of a major modern state. They held the largest pool of liquid capital in Christendom, processed the financial flows that sustained the largest institution in the Western world, and were therefore at the centre of every significant financial transaction in Europe. Giovanni di Bici's cultivation of the papal banking relationship was not merely commercially shrewd. It was the foundation of the political power that the next generation of Medici would build on it. Giovanni died in 1429, leaving the bank and its political opportunities to his son Cosimo. His specific instruction to Cosimo, recorded in the chronicles and repeated by the family as a kind of founding text, was to stay out of politics as much as possible, to cultivate influence without seeking office, to be generous with the city's communal needs without making that generosity into a claim on political authority. It was advice that Cosimo understood perfectly and applied with exactly the combination of respect and creative interpretation that good advice from dead fathers tends to receive. Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo il Vecchio, Cosimo the Elder, as he came to be known to distinguish him from the later Cosimo, who would be the first Grand Duke, is one of the most fascinating political intelligences of the 15th century. a man who ruled Florence for more than 30 years without ever holding an official position that described what he was actually doing. He was not a king. He was not a duke. He was not formally anything beyond the head of a banking family and an occasional holder of the specific communal offices that the Florentine Republic rotated among its eligible citizens. And yet by the time of his death in 1464, the historian and statesman Francesco Guicciardini would write of him that he had used his power to govern the city and do everything as he pleased, an assessment that the evidence of 30 years of Florentine political history amply supports. The crisis that preceded Cosimo's rise to dominance was one of the more dramatic episodes in the political history of a city that specialized in dramatic political episodes. In 1433, the Albizzi family, the most powerful of the families that competed with the Medici for political dominance in Florence, managed to have Cosimo arrested and brought before the Signoria, the ruling council, on charges of attempting to make himself lord of the city, a charge that combined the specific language of Florentine Republican anxiety with the practical reality that Cosimo's wealth and his network of clients and obligations were indeed making him something that resembled a lord in all but name. The trial produced a result that was characteristic of Florentine political life at its most carefully managed. Cosimo was not executed, as the Albizzi had wanted, but exiled, first to Padua and then to Venice, for 10 years. He accepted the exile with a public equanimity that his private correspondence suggest was not entirely felt, took his banking operations with him, continued to manage his affairs from Venice, and waited. He did not wait the full 10 years. In 1434, the political wind in Florence shifted with the speed that Florentine politics specialized in. A new signoria, dominated by men whose sympathies lay with the Medici rather than the Albizzi, recalled Cosimo from exile and welcomed him back to Florence with a public ceremony, whose scale suggested not the return of a private banker from a business trip, but the triumphal entry of a ruler who had been temporarily displaced. The Albizzi were themselves exiled. Cosimo was home, and the 30 years that followed established the template for Medici rule that would persist, with modifications and interruptions, for another century and a half. The template was built on several interlocking elements that Cosimo understood with unusual sophistication and managed with unusual patience. The first was the banking network itself. By the 1440s and 1450s, the Medici Bank had branches in Rome, Venice, Milan, Geneva, Lyon, Bruges, and London, making it the most geographically extensive banking operation in Europe and the natural financial partner of every significant political and commercial enterprise across the continent. The second was the patronage of art and architecture and learning, not merely as personal taste, which it also was, but as a form of political communication, a demonstration to Florence and to the watching world of the cultural height at which the Medici family operated, and the claim on civic leadership that cultural generosity implied. The third was the management of Florence's formal political institutions, the guilds, the signoria, the various councils and committees through which the Republic actually governed itself, through a combination of financial influence, family alliance, client obligation, and the careful manipulation of the electoral mechanisms that determined who sat on which body, so that the official processes of republican governance continued to function, while their outputs were reliably shaped by Medici preferences. The fourth element, and the one that is least often described with the directness it deserves, was intelligence. The systematic collection and management of information about what was happening in Florence and across Italy and in the courts of Europe, conducted through the banking network that placed Medici agents in every significant city, and gave them natural access to the commercial and political intelligence that flowed through those cities' financial arteries. A banking house with branches in Rome, Milan, Venice, Bruges, and London was, in the information environment of the 15th century, an intelligence network of the first order. The letters that travelled between the Medici branches were not merely financial correspondence. They contained political intelligence, gossip about the intentions of princes and popes, reports on the state of foreign courts, the assessments of local managers about the political situations in their cities. Cosimo read this intelligence carefully and used it with the discretion of a man who understood that information is most powerful when it's not visibly wielded. The banking operations that sustained Medici power were, in their mechanics, among the most sophisticated financial instruments that the medieval and early Renaissance world produced, and they deserve some specific attention because the history of how money moved in the 15th century is the history of how power moved, and the two are inseparable. The foundation of the Medici Bank's operations was the letter of exchange, the bill of exchange in English usage, a financial instrument that allowed merchants to transfer value between cities without physically moving coin or bullion through bandit-haunted roads and across toll-collecting borders. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity and complex in its actual operation. A merchant in Florence who needed to pay a supplier in Bruges could purchase a letter of exchange from the Medici Bank in Florence, paying in local currency at a rate that included a margin, not technically interest, because that would be usury, but a fee for the exchange service. The Medici agent in Bruges would then pay the supplier in local currency at a slightly different exchange rate that, across the round trip of the exchange cycle, produced a profit for the bank. The bill of exchange was simultaneously a credit instrument, a currency conversion service, and a payment transfer mechanism, and its operation across a network of trusted agents in multiple cities was the foundation on which the entire architecture of international commerce in the 15th century rested. The Medici did not invent it. They were its most capable practitioners, and the trust and reliability that their network maintained, the confidence of merchants across Europe that a Medici letter of exchange would be honoured at its stated value in any city where they had an agent, was itself a form of capital more valuable than any particular sum of money. The papal banking business was the most prestigious and most politically significant element of the Medici financial portfolio, and its specific character shaped the bank's operations in ways that the commercial banking business alone would not have required. The papacy collected revenues, alum dues from the mines at Tolfa in the Papal States, which the Medici would eventually control, annates from newly appointed clergy across Christendom, the proceeds of crusade indulgences, fees for dispensations and appointments, in every country in Europe, in local currencies, and needed to consolidate and transfer these revenues to Rome. The Medici network was the natural mechanism for this consolidation, and managing it required the kind of political sensitivity that commercial banking alone did not, because the papacy's financial relationships were entangled with its spiritual and political authority in ways that the purely commercial banker did not have to navigate. A cardinal whose appointment fees the Medici Bank had handled was a cardinal who knew the Medici, who owed them something in the specific currency of obligation that the Renaissance understood better than almost anything else, who was available as an ally in the complex politics of the Roman Curia. The Medici Bank at its peak in the mid-15th century employed perhaps 60 people in Florence, and a somewhat larger number across its branch network, a tiny staff by modern standards for an institution of its systemic importance. The branch managers, the fattori, the agents who ran the Bruges and London and Geneva operations, were typically young men of good family who had trained in the Florence headquarters whose education in banking practice and commercial law was provided by the bank itself, and whose loyalty was maintained by a combination of profit-sharing arrangements and the specific personal obligation that working for the Medici entailed. The accounting system that Giovanni de' Medici had established, and that Cosimo maintained, was the double-entry bookkeeping that the Venetians had developed, but that the Florentine banks applied with particular rigour, the system by which every transaction was recorded as both a debit in one account and a credit in another, creating a self-checking record that made fraud easier to detect and accounts easier to audit. The Libri Segreti, the secret books that the Medici maintained alongside their public accounts, recorded the family's personal financial position, the investments in specific partnerships, the private loans and private obligations that the public books did not capture. The branch structure of the Medici Bank was not a simple hierarchical organization with Florence at the top and the branches beneath it. It was a network of semi-independent partnerships, each organized as a separate legal entity, in which the Medici family held a majority interest alongside the branch managers who held minority stakes. But before we examine that structure, the specific papal revenue stream that the Rome branch managed deserves closer examination, because it was both the most lucrative and the most politically sensitive element of the entire Medici financial operation. The papacy's financial relationship with the Medici was not merely a matter of banking services for cash. It was a relationship of deep mutual dependence whose specific mechanics had political implications that both parties understood and neither party advertised. The revenues that the Rome branch managed included the proceeds of the alum mines at Tolfa in the Papal States, which the Medici had obtained the right to manage in 1462 after the discovery of the deposits there. Alum was an essential mordant in the textile dyeing process. Without it, dyes would not fix permanently to fabric, and before the Tolfa discovery, the primary European source of alum had been the Ottoman-controlled mines in Anatolia, which the fall of Constantinople in 1453 had made both more expensive and more politically complicated for Christian European buyers. The Tolfa deposits were substantial enough to supply most of European demand, and Pope Pius II, who recognised both the economic and political opportunity, attempted to organise a papal alum monopoly that would simultaneously enrich the papacy and put economic pressure on the Ottoman Empire by replacing its alum exports. The Medici's management of the Tolfa alum business was essentially a partnership with the papacy in this monopoly. They handled the commercial distribution of the alum across Europe, advancing money to the papacy against future alum revenues and taking a commission on the distribution that was, by the mid-15th century, one of their most profitable single business lines. The espionage dimension of the Medici operation was perhaps the least documented but the most politically significant aspect of their power, and it deserves direct attention. The banking network that placed Medici agents in Rome, Milan, Venice, Bruges, London, and every other significant commercial and political centre in Europe was, as we've noted, simultaneously an intelligence network of the first order. But the intelligence it gathered was not incidental to the commercial operation. It was managed with deliberate care and used with strategic sophistication. The letters that passed between the Florence headquarters and the branch managers were not merely financial correspondence. They contained detailed reports on the political situations in their cities, the health of foreign rulers, the movements of armies, the factional alignments in foreign courts, the rumours circulating in diplomatic circles. A Medici agent in Rome who was handling the papal accounts was also, by the natural operation of his position, present at meals where cardinals discussed the papacy's diplomatic intentions. A Medici agent in Bruges who was managing the relations with the Burgundian court was also in regular contact with the merchants and diplomats who knew the Duke of Burgundy's military plans. The information flowed naturally through the banking channels and was read, processed and acted upon in Florence by Cosimo and his successors with the careful discretion of men who understood that the value of intelligence lies in its undisclosed possession. The ciphers that the Medici used in their most sensitive correspondence, the substitution codes and the specific conventions that allowed sensitive political information to be transmitted through letters that might be intercepted by hostile postal authorities, are among the most interesting documentary evidence of the systematic intelligence operation that the banking network supported. The Archive of State in Florence preserves thousands of Medici letters and the layers of their communication, the straightforward commercial content on the surface, the political intelligence encoded or simply noted in terms whose significance would be apparent only to informed readers, are one of the most revealing windows into the specific operation of Renaissance political intelligence. This structure served several purposes simultaneously. It limited the legal liability of the Florence headquarters if a branch failed. It gave branch managers a financial incentive to manage well by making their compensation contingent on profitability, and it created a degree of operational flexibility that a purely hierarchical structure would have lacked. When the London branch made bad loans to English kings who declined to repay them, the losses were contained within the London partnership rather than destroying the entire bank. When the Bruges branch overextended itself in the wool trade in the 1470s and 1480s, the collapse was painful but limited. The structural wisdom of Giovanni de' Bicci's diversification principle was tested repeatedly and vindicated almost as often. Almost. Because the Medici Bank also made the error that Giovanni de' Bicci had specifically warned against, the concentration of risk in a single borrower of overwhelming political importance. And when it did, the consequences were severe. The loans that the Bruges and London branches extended to the Dukes of Burgundy and the English crown in the 1460s through the 1480s, under the management of a branch director named Tommaso Portinari, whose commercial ambition consistently exceeded his risk judgment, were the slow-building crisis that would eventually contribute to the bank's destruction. Portinari has the distinction of being both a significant figure in the history of Flemish art. He commissioned Hugo van der Gogh's extraordinary Portinari altarpiece, now in the Uffizi, which was one of the most influential works of Flemish painting to reach Italy, and one of the men most responsible for the financial overextension that weakened the Medici Bank in its final decades. Art history and financial history intersect in him with an irony that is characteristic of the Medici story at its most layered. Cosimo de' Medici's relationship to the arts is one of the most consequential patronage relationships in the history of Western culture, and it cannot be understood as purely philanthropic or purely decorative. It was political, it was personal, it was philosophical, and it was genuinely driven by a love of beautiful things and profound ideas that the evidence of Cosimo's private life confirms with a consistency that the public political calculation cannot fully explain. He was a man of considerable intellectual seriousness, who spent real time with the scholars he patronized, who read the manuscripts he commissioned, who participated in the philosophical discussions his support enabled with the engaged curiosity of someone who found the material genuinely interesting rather than merely respectable. The rebuilding of the monastery of San Marco in Florence, which Cosimo funded from 1437 onward at his personal expense, at a cost that the records suggest was enormous even by his standards, was both a work of personal piety and a statement of civic patronage. The architect Michelozzo, who became Cosimo's preferred architectural collaborator for this and several subsequent projects, redesigned the monastery in the austere, classically influenced style that would become the architectural signature of the early Florentine Renaissance, and Fra Angelico, the Dominican friar and painter whose frescoes in the cells of San Marco are among the most contemplative and quietly powerful works in the history of European devotional art, executed the decorative program that made the rebuilt monastery one of the most beautiful religious buildings in the city. The library that Cosimo established at San Marco, stocking it with manuscripts collected by humanist scholars and the great book hunter Poggio Bracciolini, was the first public library in Florence and one of the first in Europe, open to scholars who could use the collection that Cosimo's money had assembled, an act of cultural generosity that was also an act of cultural leadership, the establishment of a claim on the intellectual life of the city that money and taste and judgment together could sustain. The building of the Palazzo Medici on the Via Larga, begun in 1445 to a design by Michelozzo, completed in the 1460s, and serving as the family home and the headquarters of the bank and the centre of Florentine cultural life simultaneously, was the most visible statement of Medici power in stone. Cosimo had initially approached Filippo Brunelleschi, the greatest architect of the age, and the man who had just completed the dome of the Florence Cathedral, in an engineering achievement of such audacity and precision that it had no precedent in the history of medieval construction, about designing the palazzo, but had then rejected Brunelleschi's design as too grand, too conspicuous, too obviously the palace of a ruler rather than the home of a wealthy citizen. The story, whether entirely accurate or partly invented by a later tradition, captures something true about Cosimo's political intelligence. He understood that a family that was not officially ruling Florence could not afford to look like it was officially ruling Florence. The Palazzo Medici is magnificent. It is not a palace. The distinction was deliberate. Inside the palace, the art collection that Cosimo and his son Piero and his grandson Lorenzo assembled across 3 generations became the nucleus of what is now the oldest and most visited art museum in the world. The commissions that Cosimo placed with Donatello, whose bronze David was the first freestanding male nude in European sculpture since antiquity, with Fra Angelico, with Paolo Uccello, whose Battle of San Romano Cosimo commissioned in a triptych for his bedroom, with Benozzo Gozzoli, whose Journey of the Magi fresco in the family chapel depicts the Medici themselves among the biblical procession with a self-confidence that is either piety or audacity, and is probably both, established the Medici as the dominant patrons of Florentine art in the first half of the 15th century. The specific character of their patronage, the preference for classical themes and classical forms, the integration of ancient philosophical concepts into Christian artistic programs, the willingness to commission unprecedented subjects and unprecedented scales, shaped the direction of Florentine art in ways that the subsequent history of Western art has made it impossible to overstate. Donatello deserves particular mention because the relationship between Cosimo and this extraordinary sculptor was one of the closest and most sustained in the entire history of artistic patronage. Donatello was a man of difficult temperament and impractical personal habits. Cosimo at one point reportedly set him up with a house and a regular income specifically because Donatello was incapable of managing his own finances, and the bronze and marble and stone works he produced across a 50-year career that paralleled Cosimo's rise to power are among the defining objects of the Italian Renaissance. The bronze David that Cosimo commissioned for the Palazzo Medici's courtyard in the 1440s, the first freestanding male nude in European sculpture since antiquity, a work so technically ambitious and iconographically complex that scholars have been arguing about its meaning for 5 centuries, was the kind of commission that only a patron with Cosimo's combination of money, confidence, and genuine aesthetic understanding could have made. It said, "We are the heirs of the ancient world. We are bringing it back. We can do this." The scholarly tradition that Cosimo nurtured within his household and under his patronage was as significant as the artistic one, and it was embodied above all in the Platonic Academy that the philosopher Marsilio Ficino established in Cosimo's villa at Careggi in the hills above Florence. The Platonic Academy was not an institution in the formal sense. It had no charter, no fixed membership, no regular schedule. It was a circle of intellectuals, humanist scholars, and cultivated aristocrats who gathered around Ficino's translations of and commentaries on Plato and the Neoplatonist tradition, engaged in the philosophical conversations that these texts generated and produced in the process a body of philosophical writing and a cultural climate that was one of the primary intellectual foundations of the Renaissance. Ficino himself is one of the most important and least celebrated figures in the intellectual history of the Renaissance. He had been identified as a prodigy of learning in his youth and had been placed by Cosimo in a specific educational program designed to make him the translator of the complete works of Plato into Latin, a project of enormous cultural ambition, because the complete works of Plato had not been available in Latin since the fall of Rome, and their recovery was one of the great intellectual projects of the 15th century humanist tradition. Ficino completed this project and then went beyond it, translating the Hermetic texts that were thought to be even more ancient than Plato, writing his own philosophical syntheses that attempted to reconcile Platonic philosophy with Christian theology, and conducting the ongoing philosophical conversation at Careggi that made the villa one of the intellectual centres of the 15th century. His concept of Platonic love, the love of beautiful things as a path toward the love of God, the idea that human beauty and divine beauty are continuous rather than opposed, was one of the most influential philosophical contributions of the period, entering European poetry and painting and music through the culture of the Medici circle, and remaining there for centuries. The Platonic Academy at Careggi was the place where Cosimo spent the last years of his life, increasingly ill and increasingly at peace, having outlived his eldest son Giovanni and left the management of the bank to his younger son Piero. He died in August 1464. The Signoria of Florence, in recognition of what he had been and what he had done, regardless of what it officially had and had not been, voted him posthumously the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, the same title that the Roman Republic had given to Cicero. The inscription on his tomb in San Lorenzo, the church that Cosimo had rebuilt and that Brunelleschi had designed, reads simply, Cosimo de' Medici, Pater Patriae. It says everything that needed to be said. Cosimo's son Piero, who inherited the family's position in 1464, had the particular misfortune of following a titan and preceding another one. But before Piero's brief tenure, there are 2 episodes of Cosimo's long reign that deserve more attention than the arc of the political narrative has allowed them. The Council of Florence in 1439 and what it brought to the city, and the specific nature of the Medici network in the decade after Cosimo's return from exile. The Council of Florence was one of the most extraordinary intellectual events of the 15th century, and it happened in Florence partly because of Cosimo's specific efforts to ensure that it did. The council had originally been called as the Council of Basel in 1431, with the primary purpose of addressing the Hussite heresy in Bohemia and the broader question of the relationship between the authority of church councils and the authority of the papacy, a theological and institutional dispute of enormous complexity and political consequence. Its business had been conducted at Basel, and then at Ferrara with the slowness that characterized medieval ecclesiastical assemblies, and by 1439 it had moved to Florence, under a combination of circumstances that included the need for a city with better facilities, sufficient wealth to support the enormous delegation from the Byzantine Empire that was attending in hopes of negotiating a union between the Eastern and Western churches, and sufficient political stability to provide a safe environment for a gathering of this sensitivity and this importance. Cosimo's role in moving the council to Florence, and in making its operations run smoothly, he provided the financial guarantees and the logistical support that hosting the Byzantine delegation required, was both civic and personal, because the council brought to Florence one of the most extraordinary collections of Greek learning that the Western world had ever encountered in a single place. The Byzantine delegation included not only the Emperor John VIII, Palaiologos, and the Patriarch of Constantinople, but also scholars of the first rank. Gemistos Plethon, the Platonic philosopher who had spent decades at the Byzantine court developing a revival of Neoplatonic philosophy that was far more thoroughgoing than anything the Latin West had attempted. Bessarion, the cardinal who had become the great patron of Greek learning in Rome, and whose personal library was one of the foundations of the Marciana Library in Venice. Their presence in Florence for months during the council's sessions was the direct catalyst for Cosimo's specific decision to commission Marsilio Ficino, still a child in 1439 but identified very early as a prodigy, to translate the complete works of Plato into Latin. Cosimo had met Plethon. He had heard him speak. He had understood that the Greek philosophical tradition was a vast inheritance that the Latin West had barely begun to access, and he made the decision to access it. The Council of Florence produced, in terms of its stated purpose, the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, an agreement whose practical effects dissolved almost immediately, because the Byzantine emperor needed papal support against the Ottoman Turks, and was willing to agree to theological formulations that the Orthodox clergy back in Constantinople repudiated the moment he returned home. What it produced instead was the transfer to Florence of a significant body of Greek manuscripts and Greek learning, and the stimulus to the humanist project of classical recovery that would define the intellectual program of Cosimo's patronage for the following 25 years. The Council of Florence was a pivotal moment for what we now call the Renaissance, the event through which the living tradition of Greek philosophical learning encountered the Italian humanist recovery of Latin classical learning, and produced something new from the encounter. And it happened in Florence rather than Ferrara or Venice or Rome, because Cosimo de' Medici had the specific combination of financial resources, civic influence and intellectual curiosity to make it happen there. He governed for only 5 years, from 1464 to 1469, in a condition of physical suffering. He was so crippled by gout that he was carried to public appearances and spent significant periods bedridden, that gave him the nickname Il Gottoso, the Gouty. The 5 years were not uneventful. He faced a conspiracy, the Pitti Conspiracy of 1466, organised by a coalition of Florentine families who had concluded that the Medici dominance of the city was incompatible with the republic they professed to maintain, and who attempted to use a banking crisis and a political confrontation to force the Medici to accept reduced power. Piero managed the crisis with more firmness than his physical condition might have suggested, drawing on the loyalty of the countryside and the smaller guilds against the merchant oligarchy that was organising against him. The conspiracy collapsed. The conspirators were exiled or fined. Piero died in December 1469 at the age of 53, leaving the family's position and the bank and the informal governance of Florence to his 2 sons. Lorenzo, 20 years old, and Giuliano 16. Lorenzo would become the most famous Medici, the figure whose name the Renaissance has been most persistently attached to, the man whose combination of political genius and cultural patronage and personal charisma produced an image so polished and so complete that it has sometimes been difficult for subsequent historians to see through it to the more complicated reality beneath. But the image has enough truth in it to sustain the reputation, and the truth is genuinely remarkable. Lorenzo de' Medici was extraordinary in ways that the word itself barely captures. He was not, despite the image, physically remarkable. Contemporary descriptions and the surviving portraits agree that he was dark-complexioned, with an oversized jaw and a flat, slightly misshapen nose. His sense of smell, he reportedly said, was poor, and a voice described as harsh and rough. None of this mattered particularly, because what Lorenzo possessed was the specific quality of personal magnetism that has nothing to do with conventional attractiveness, and everything to do with intelligence, energy, and the kind of confident attention that makes the person you are talking to feel like the most important person in the room. He had grown up at the centre of the most cultivated court in Europe, had been educated by the humanist scholars his grandfather and father patronised, had begun writing vernacular Italian poetry at a precociously young age, and would continue writing it throughout his life at a level of genuine literary quality that is not merely the compliment that biographers pay to powerful men's hobbies, but the honest assessment that his verse deserves. He was a serious poet who happened also to be the ruler of a major Renaissance state, and the combination was unusual enough that his contemporaries found it remarkable. The crisis that defined the first decade of Lorenzo's rule was not one he created, but one that was created for him, by his enemies, in a place and at a moment of maximum symbolic horror. The Pazzi conspiracy of April 26, 1478, is one of the most dramatic single events in the political history of the Italian Renaissance, and it has been the subject of more historical attention than almost any other episode of the period, partly because of its dramatic setting, and partly because of what it reveals about the specific quality of Italian Renaissance political culture. The mixture of family loyalty, political ambition, personal honour, and theological convenience that made conspiracy and assassination not merely possible, but, in certain circumstances, practically routine. The Pazzi family were the Medici's primary rivals in the Florentine banking world. They were an ancient family of considerable wealth and social prestige, older than the Medici in their Florentine prominence, and they had been watching the Medici's progressive consolidation of political and banking dominance with a resentment that had several specific causes. The most immediate was the decision by Pope Sixtus IV, himself a man of political aggressiveness unusual even by the standards of the Renaissance papacy, to transfer the management of the papal accounts from the Medici Bank to the Pazzi Bank in 1476, a decision that was both a financial blow to the Medici and a political signal that the papacy under Sixtus was not going to be the automatic ally of the Medici that it had been under previous popes. Sixtus had also granted to the Pazzi, over the specific objection of Lorenzo, the inheritance rights to a wealthy estate whose previous owner had died without clear heirs, a decision that Lorenzo had attempted to block through his influence over Florentine law, and that Sixtus had reversed, setting the two parties in direct and personal conflict. The conspiracy that developed from these accumulated grievances involved the Pazzi family, Pope Sixtus IV's nephew Girolamo Riario, the Archbishop of Pisa Francesco Salviati, and a number of other figures whose specific roles in the planning have been debated by historians ever since. The question of how directly Sixtus IV was personally involved in a plan whose ultimate objective was the assassination of Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano has never been fully resolved. Sixtus afterward claimed that he had known nothing of the assassination plot, only of a plan to arrest and depose the Medici brothers, a distinction that the subsequent evidence makes difficult to credit fully, but impossible to completely disprove. The plan was to murder Lorenzo and Giuliano simultaneously. During High Mass at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore on April 26, 1478, at the moment of the elevation of the Host, the most sacred moment of the Catholic liturgy, the moment when the congregation's attention was most completely directed away from anything except the altar, the selection of this moment was either a piece of specific tactical calculation, the target would be kneeling, distracted, unlikely to have his hand on a weapon, or an act of extraordinary theological audacity, using the sacred moment as a cover for murder, or both. And the plotters' willingness to proceed suggests that they had either convinced themselves that divine sanction outweighed the sacrilege, or had decided that practical advantage outweighed theological scruple. The execution of the conspiracy was partial and therefore, from the conspirators' perspective, catastrophic. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed to death in the cathedral. 19 wounds, the chronicles record with the specific attention to number that violent deaths attract, by Francesco de' Pazzi and Bernardo Baroncelli, who completed their assignment with a thoroughness that the number attests. Lorenzo was wounded in the neck but managed to escape into the sacristy, where the heavy bronze doors were locked against the pursuing assassins. He survived. And a conspiracy that was designed to decapitate the Medici power structure by removing both brothers in the same moment had instead killed one and inflamed the other into a response whose ferocity surprised even those who'd expected severity. Lorenzo's response was swift, comprehensive, and in its specific application of terror entirely calculated to communicate what would happen to anyone who attempted the same thing again. The Archbishop Salviati, who'd been assigned to seize the Palazzo della Signoria while the murders were being committed, was captured within hours and hanged from a window of the palazzo itself, in full public view, in his archbishop's vestments, a spectacle of such deliberate horror that it communicated the message without requiring any accompanying text. Francesco de' Pazzi was hanged alongside him. Baroncelli fled to Constantinople and was eventually returned to Florence, tried, and hanged. The head of the Pazzi family, Jacopo de' Pazzi, was captured, tortured, executed, and then, in the specific cruelty that Renaissance political violence occasionally achieved, was exhumed from his initial grave when reports suggested he'd been buried with honours, dragged through the streets, and thrown into the Arno. Members of the Pazzi family who had not participated in the conspiracy, but whose surname was now politically toxic, were imprisoned or exiled. The Pazzi name was declared extinct. Their coat of arms was erased from public buildings. The family was not merely punished, it was unmade. The papal response to Lorenzo's counter-violence was itself violent. Sixtus IV excommunicated Lorenzo, placed Florence under interdict, and allied himself with Naples in declaring war on the Florentine Republic. The 2-year war that followed was a genuine crisis for Florence, whose territory was invaded and whose commerce was disrupted, and it was resolved in a way that displayed what Lorenzo could do when he applied his political intelligence at full intensity. In December 1479, Lorenzo travelled personally to Naples, alone, without safe conduct, placing himself entirely in the power of King Ferrante of Naples, a man whose goodwill he could not be certain of, and whose personal methods were among the less gentle in a generally ungentle period, and negotiated a peace settlement in person over several months of residence at the Neapolitan court. The settlement he brought back included a separate peace with Naples that left Sixtus isolated and effectively forced the Pope to accept terms that he found unsatisfactory. Lorenzo returned to Florence in March 1480 to a reception whose warmth suggested that his city had understood what he had risked and what he had achieved. The 10 years after the Pazzi conspiracy were the decade in which Lorenzo consolidated his control of Florence in ways that left less ambiguity about what the political arrangement actually was. But before we examine that consolidation, the specific diplomatic crisis that followed the conspiracy deserves the attention it rarely receives in the popular telling of the Pazzi story, because it was in some respects more dangerous to Lorenzo's position than the assassination attempt itself. The war with the papacy and Naples that followed the conspiracy's aftermath was not merely a matter of military pressure on Florentine territory, though that pressure was real, and the invading armies did genuine damage to the Florentine contado, the agricultural territory surrounding the city that was both economically important and symbolically significant as evidence of Florence's territorial sovereignty. It was also a crisis of commercial isolation, because Pope Sixtus IV's interdict against Florence, the ecclesiastical ban that prohibited the saying of Mass in the city and the administration of sacraments to its citizens, was a weapon of economic as well as spiritual warfare. Merchants who traded with an interdicted city risked ecclesiastical sanction themselves, and the interdict therefore threatened the commercial relationships on which the Florentine economy depended at the same moment that the military pressure was threatening the physical security of the Florentine territory. Lorenzo's management of this double crisis was a diplomatic performance of the highest order. He secured the support of the other Italian powers, Milan, Ferrara, and eventually Venice, through a combination of argument and financial incentive that demonstrated the breadth of the Medici client network across Italy. He maintained the morale of Florence's population through public rhetoric that framed the war as an attack on Florentine liberty rather than on Medici power, a framing that was not dishonest, since the papacy and Naples were indeed threatening Florentine independence, but that conveniently made the defence of the Medici synonymous with the defence of the Republic. He kept the Florentine military going through a 2-year conflict with the combination of financial subsidy and diplomatic manoeuvre that his resources and his intelligence network made possible. And then he went to Naples alone. The decision to go personally to Ferdinand of Aragon, Ferrante, as the Neapolitan king was known, the most unpredictable and in some respects the most dangerous of the Italian princes, was the most dramatic personal gamble of Lorenzo's political career. There was no guarantee that Ferrante would receive him with the diplomatic courtesy that embassies formally required, because Ferrante was a man whose personal methods included the notorious collection of taxidermied enemies that he reportedly maintained as a reminder of the fate of those who crossed him. There was no guarantee that the peace Lorenzo intended to negotiate was one that Ferrante was willing to make on terms that Florence could accept. There was no guarantee, most fundamentally, that Ferrante would not decide that having Lorenzo in Naples was too tempting an opportunity to waste. Lorenzo stayed in Naples from December 1479 to March 1480. 3 months in the court of a dangerous man conducting the most consequential diplomatic negotiation of his career while maintaining the appearance of a confident, culturally sophisticated guest rather than a supplicant seeking terms. The intelligence he had gathered over years through the Medici banking network about Ferrante's specific concerns, his relationship with the Ottoman threat in the Eastern Mediterranean, his financial needs, his dynastic anxieties about the French claim to Naples, gave Lorenzo the specific purchase points on which his negotiation could operate. He left Naples with a peace settlement that separated Naples from the papal coalition, left Sixtus isolated, and was accepted by the Pope himself as the best available outcome within a few months. The Florentines who received him on his return treated him as a returning hero, which was not an exaggeration. The constitutional changes of 1480, the creation of the Council of 70, a body whose composition was effectively controlled by Lorenzo and whose approval was required for major political decisions, reduced the practical independence of the older republican institutions in ways that were dressed in the language of reform and administrative efficiency, but they were understood by contemporaries to be what they were, the formalization of personal power. Lorenzo was not troubled by the contradiction between his governance of a republic and his exercise of something closely resembling princely authority. He'd grown up in a city that had maintained exactly this contradiction for 50 years under his grandfather and great-uncle, and he managed it with the same combination of genuine civic generosity and systematic political control. The cultural life of Lorenzo's Florence was the most celebrated aspect of his rule even in his own lifetime, and it is the aspect that has given the period its retrospective name. Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, was a title given to Lorenzo as a conventional honorific of the period, and not specifically an acknowledgement of his patronage, but it has become synonymous with the cultural achievement of his reign in a way that the accident of naming has made permanent. The specific artists and scholars and poets who operated in the orbit of the Medici court in the 1470s and 1480s constitute what may be the most impressive single concentration of artistic and intellectual talent in the history of any city in any period. Sandro Botticelli painted for the Medici Circle works of such mythological and philosophical complexity and such extraordinary visual beauty that they have become among the most reproduced images in the history of Western art. The Birth of Venus and the Primavera, both painted for branches of the Medici family in the early 1480s, are not merely beautiful paintings. They are philosophical arguments in paint, dense with Neoplatonic symbolism, drawn from Ficino's philosophy, and from the classical tradition that the Platonic Academy at Carregi had been recovering and interpreting for 3 decades. The Venus of the first painting is simultaneously the classical goddess of love and a figure of Neoplatonic spiritual beauty, rising from the sea in a posture of vulnerable perfection that the Florentine humanist tradition had been preparing the visual culture to receive. The Primavera is a more crowded and more overtly allegorical composition. Venus as the central figure of a mythological garden where the Graces dance and Mercury gestures toward the heavens, and Flora scatters flowers in an image that has resisted complete interpretation for 5 centuries, while revealing enough of its meaning to ensure that the attempt continues. The young Michelangelo, who entered the Medici household as a boy of perhaps 14 or 15 in the early 1490s and who studied sculpture in the Garden of San Marco under the tutelage of Bertoldo di Giovanni, was formed in the specific cultural environment that Lorenzo maintained. He ate at Lorenzo's table, participated in the philosophical discussions of the Platonic circle, was treated by Lorenzo with a personal affection that the age gap made paternal, and that Michelangelo remembered with gratitude throughout his very long life. The specific intellectual formation of those years, the Neoplatonic philosophy, the classical study, the sustained exposure to the greatest art collection in Italy, shaped the work of the artist who would paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and carve the David and the Pietà, making the Medici household not merely a patron of a single artist, but a formative influence on the work that subsequent centuries would regard as the highest achievement of the entire Renaissance tradition. The humanist scholars Poliziano, Pico della Mirandola, Cristoforo Landino, who made up the intellectual core of Lorenzo's circle, were not mere ornaments. But before we discuss their philosophical project, the specific figure of Angelo Poliziano, Angelo Ambrogini, called Poliziano from his hometown of Montepulciano, deserves attention as the person who was simultaneously Lorenzo's closest intellectual companion, the tutor of his children, the house poet of the Medici court and one of the most accomplished classical scholars of the 15th century. Poliziano had come to the Medici household as a boy of about 10, identified as a prodigy and taken under the family's patronage in the specific way that the Medici had developed for gifted young men without independent means. He had begun translating Homer into Latin hexameters at the age of 14, and his classical learning was of a precision and a depth that even the most learned humanists of the period found formidable. As a young man in the Medici household, he fell out with Lorenzo's wife, Clarice Orsini, a Roman noblewoman whose choice as Lorenzo's bride had been dictated by political necessity rather than cultural affinity, and whose conservative Roman Catholic values sat uneasily with the Neoplatonic philosophical environment of the Medici court, over the classical texts that Poliziano was using to educate the Medici children. Clarice wanted the children instructed in the Psalms. Poliziano was teaching them Homer. The incompatibility produced a rupture and a brief departure from the household, but Lorenzo brought him back because Lorenzo needed Poliziano more than he needed the domestic peace that Poliziano's presence disturbed. The stanze per la giostra, the verses that Poliziano wrote to commemorate a jousting tournament in which Giuliano de' Medici had participated before the Pazzi conspiracy, verses that were interrupted by the assassination before they could be completed and that survive as a fragment of extraordinary beauty, are the best evidence of what the Medici court's literary culture produced at its peak. Classical learning and vernacular Italian beauty combined in a form of such elegance that the incompleteness of the poem feels less like a failure of execution than like a particularly heartbreaking accident of history. Poliziano also composed the Orfeo, the first secular drama in Italian theatrical history, performed at the Mantuan court in 1480, and the Fabula di Orfeo is a work that sits at the intersection of classical mythology, humanist literary theory, and the vernacular Italian theatrical tradition in a way that no previous work in any of those traditions had quite managed. The debates that occurred among this circle about the relationship between Platonic philosophy and Christian theology, about the relative merits of the active life and the contemplative life, about whether the vernacular Italian could be the medium for serious literary expression, or whether Latin alone was adequate to intellectual ambition, were not merely academic exercises, but genuine and sometimes heated disagreements among people who cared about the questions and whose answers had practical consequences for the work they were producing. Lorenzo's championing of the vernacular was, in this context, both a personal literary preference and a position in an ongoing aesthetic and philosophical argument that the circle conducted with the specific intensity of people who believed, correctly, that what they decided had implications extending well beyond their own conversation. They were active participants in the ongoing philosophical project of reconciling the classical tradition with Christian theology, of recovering the full range of ancient learning and using it to illuminate the spiritual and intellectual questions that the 15th century was posing to itself. Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man, written in 1486 as an introduction to a set of 900 philosophical theses that he proposed to debate publicly in Rome, a project the papacy found presumptuous enough to forbid, is often described as the founding document of Renaissance humanism, its claim that human beings occupy a unique position in creation by virtue of their capacity to freely shape themselves toward either the divine or the bestial, representing a radical departure from the medieval understanding of human nature as fixed by its place in the hierarchical order. Lorenzo himself participated in these discussions not merely as a patron, but as an intellectual, contributing to the philosophical conversation with his own poetry and with the seriousness of engagement that his education had equipped him for. His vernacular poems, the carnival songs, the Neoplatonic love poetry, the pastoral verse, were circulated and celebrated in his own lifetime and established the Tuscan vernacular as a vehicle for serious literary expression at a time when Latin was still the prestige language of scholarship. His championing of the vernacular tradition was not merely cultural preference, it was a political act, the assertion that the language of the Florentine people was adequate for the highest literary and philosophical expression, and therefore that the culture produced in and for Florence was not provincial or derivative, but central to the literary tradition of the age. Lorenzo's health began to deteriorate in the late 1480s, the hereditary gout that had killed his father and grandfather manifesting with increasing severity. By 1491 he was seriously ill, spending long periods at the Medici villas in the countryside outside Florence, conducting the business of the city from his sickbed, with the assistance of the secretaries and officials who formed the administrative apparatus of informal Medici rule. In the spring of 1492 his condition deteriorated rapidly. The deathbed scene that the period's chroniclers preserve in various accounts includes the famous, and almost certainly invented or at least heavily embellished, visit of the friar Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican preacher who had already become the most powerful voice of religious reform in Florence, and who would, after Lorenzo's death, emerge as the dominant figure in Florentine public life. The story as told by Savonarola's partisans has the friar visit the dying Lorenzo and demand that he restore Florence's liberty, that he renounce the political control that the Medici had exercised over the Republic, as a condition of receiving absolution. Lorenzo's response in this version was to turn his face to the wall without speaking, and Savonarola left without granting absolution. The story is politically constructed. Savonarola had reason to establish that Lorenzo had died unrepentant of his tyranny, and Lorenzo's admirers had reason to establish that Savonarola had behaved with cruelty toward a dying man. What is not disputed is that Lorenzo de' Medici died on April 9th, 1492, at the age of 43. The political world he had managed for 23 years immediately began to fall apart. His eldest son Piero, who inherited the informal governance of Florence, was not the man his father had been. He was 20 years old, proud, imperious, and insufficiently interested in the patient, attentive management of the city's political networks that Florentine informal rule required. He had the Medici name and the Medici wealth, but not the Medici judgment, and the crisis that tested him, the French invasion of Italy in 1494, when Charles VIII of France marched an army down the peninsula toward Naples, and the Italian states had to decide how to position themselves relative to this overwhelming force, exposed the limitations of his political intelligence with a thoroughness and a speed that left very little room for interpretation. Piero's response to the French invasion was to negotiate with Charles VIII directly and personally, surrendering to French demands that included the transfer of several Florentine fortresses to French control, fortresses that Florentines regarded as part of their city's defensive sovereignty, without consulting the Signoria or maintaining the political relationships that would have allowed him to present the concessions as a managed outcome rather than a humiliation. The Florentines, when they learned what Piero had agreed to, were not merely unhappy, they were furious. On November 9th, 1494, when Piero returned to Florence, the gates of the Palazzo della Signoria were shut against him. He was expelled from the city. The Medici were in exile. The exile of the Medici in 1494 was not merely a political reversal. It was the beginning of a chaotic 18-year period in Florentine history. the years of Savonarola's moral republic, the bonfire of the vanities, the burning of Savonarola himself, the restored republic, and its complicated relationship with Machiavelli's political science, during which Florence discovered that the Medici's informal management of the city had created a political culture so dependent on their specific combination of money and attention and judgment that the city could not easily govern itself without them. Girolamo Savonarola filled the political vacuum with a religious authority that was, in the short term, overwhelming and, in the slightly longer term, self-destructive. The Dominican friar who'd been preaching in Florence since 1489 and whose sermons combining prophetic vision, moral denunciation, and political criticism had made him the most popular preacher in the city while Lorenzo was still alive, found after Lorenzo's death and the French invasion and the Medici exile that his prophetic reputation was confirmed in ways that gave him an almost unassailable public authority. He had predicted the French invasion. The French had come. He had predicted the fall of the Medici. The Medici had fallen. God was speaking through him, and the Florentines, in their specific combination of political anxiety and religious intensity, were willing to listen. The bonfire of the vanities, the public burning of mirrors, cosmetics, wigs, carnival masks, secular art and books and musical instruments, organised by Savonarola's followers through the city in 1497 and again in 1498, was the most visually dramatic expression of the moral programme that Savonarola was trying to impose on Florence, and it included in its destructive inventory works of art whose loss subsequent centuries have mourned. Botticelli, whose mythological paintings had been the visual expression of the Neoplatonic culture of the Medici court, was reportedly so affected by Savonarola's preaching that he brought some of his own works to the bonfire. Whether or not this is literally true, the image captures the severity of the cultural rupture that Savonarola represented. The political arrangement that Savonarola had helped construct, a reformed republic based on the Great Council of all eligible Florentine citizens, organised on Venetian lines, with God as the true sovereign of the city, collapsed when he lost the support of Pope Alexander VI, who'd initially tolerated his reform movement, and then, when Savonarola's preaching began to include pointed criticisms of the papacy itself, excommunicated him in 1497. The trial by fire that Savonarola's opponents organised in 1498, a public ordeal in which representatives of Savonarola's cause and his opponents were to walk through fire to demonstrate divine favour, was called off at the last moment, leaving the crowds assembled in the Piazza della Signoria disappointed and angry, and the subsequent riot against Savonarola ended with his arrest, trial, torture, and execution by hanging and burning in the same piazza on May 23, 1498. Niccolò Machiavelli, who was appointed secretary of the Second Chancery of the Florentine Republic shortly after Savonarola's execution, spent the next 14 years as a diplomat and military organiser for the Republic that functioned without the Medici. His observations of Italian political reality during this period, the specific ways in which power was obtained, maintained, lost, and regained, the relationship between political effectiveness and political morality, the role of force and consent and reputation in the governance of states, became the material for The Prince, written in 1513 after the Medici restoration had ended his republican career, and for the discourses on Livy, and for the other works that made him the first systematic theorist of modern political science. Machiavelli is often described as a product of the Renaissance in general terms. He is more specifically a product of the specific Florentine political culture that the Medici had created and that their absence had thrown into painful relief. The Prince is, among many other things, a careful analysis of what went wrong when Piero di Lorenzo de' Medici failed in 1494 and what it would take to do it right. The Medici returned to Florence in 1512, restored by a Spanish army that had descended through Italy as part of the general collapse of the Republic that the Holy League's military pressure had made inevitable. Lorenzo the Younger, Lorenzo di Piero di Lorenzo, the grandson of Il Magnifico, was installed as the effective ruler of Florence, and the political arrangements that the restored Medici established were considerably more explicitly authoritarian than the earlier Medici's carefully maintained fiction of republican governance. The lesson that the restored Medici and their advisers drew from 1494 was that the fiction of republican informality had been too easily exploited by enemies and too dependent on the specific qualities of individuals who happened to be Cosimo or Lorenzo. The next Medici regime would be more formally, if still not quite officially, autocratic. Before we arrive at the papal elevation of Giovanni, it is worth pausing on the Medici women whose stories the political narrative of the family's male line tends to obscure, because the Medici produced, in the 16th century, two queens of France whose influence on French history was as significant as anything the male line achieved in Florence or Rome, and whose stories are among the most dramatic in the entire chronicle of a dramatic family. Caterina de' Medici, Catherine de' Medici in the French form by which she's known to history, was the daughter of Lorenzo di Piero di Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo il Magnifico's grandson, and was orphaned at 2 weeks old, her mother and father both dead within days of each other in April 1519. She was raised under Medici protection, survived the siege of Florence in 1529 as a hostage in the convent of Santa Lucia. There were proposals during the siege to display her on the city walls in a target for the besieging army's guns, a propaganda gambit that was discussed with the specific casual cruelty of Renaissance political warfare and ultimately not implemented, and was finally, in 1533, married to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of Francis I of France, in a union arranged by her uncle Pope Clement VII that was intended to cement French papal cooperation against the Habsburgs. Catherine arrived in France as a 14-year-old Italian girl of banking family origins in a court where Italian birth was not exactly prestigious among the French aristocracy that surrounded the king, and she spent the first decade of her marriage in a political position of considerable difficulty. Her husband publicly preferred his mistress Diane de Poitiers, who was 20 years his senior and who maintained her influence over Henri throughout his life, with a completeness that Catherine could not match. For 10 years, Catherine produced no children, which in the dynastic politics of the 16th century was the specific failure that most threatened a queen consort's position. Then she produced 10 children in 12 years, which resolved that problem and created others, because the health of those children was precarious, and the deaths of several of them in their childhood and young adulthood would define the political crises of her later regency. When Henri II died in 1559 from a jousting wound, a lance splinter through his visor, his death a 10-day agony in which the surgeon's attempts to treat the injury by trepanning the skulls of condemned prisoners to study the wound's anatomy produced no useful knowledge and considerable additional suffering for the prisoners. Catherine became the mother of 3 successive kings of France, and the dominant political figure of the French court for nearly 3 decades of the wars of religion that consumed France in the second half of the 16th century. The specific decisions she made, the alliance she sought with the Protestant Huguenots at some moments, the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572 at another, the complex diplomatic manoeuvring she conducted between the Guise faction and the Protestant faction, and the foreign powers who backed each, have been argued over by historians for 4 centuries without reaching a consensus that satisfies everyone, partly because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, and partly because the ideological stakes of assigning responsibility for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre have always been high enough to prevent purely dispassionate assessment. What is clear is that Catherine de' Medici governed France, in practice if not always formally, for longer than most of France's kings, that she did so in conditions of civil and religious war that would have defeated many rulers of greater formal authority, and that she maintained the French monarchy as a functioning institution through circumstances that made its survival genuinely uncertain. She died in January 1589, 8 months before her last surviving son Henri III was assassinated, having outlasted all but one of her children and having failed in the end to establish the Valois dynasty's continuation. She was 59 years old. Her political career had lasted 30 years and produced a France that was still recognisably France when she was done with it, which, given the pressures it was under, was not a negligible achievement. Marie de' Medici was the daughter of Francesco I, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and was married to Henry IV of France in 1600 in a match that had the specific character of banking transactions in royal disguise. Henri IV's enormous debts to the Medici Granducci, accumulated over years of French-Italian financial dealings, were forgiven as part of the marriage arrangement, the dowry and the debt cancellation together, making the deal financially clear if dynastic in its public expression. Her marriage to Henri, who was himself a man of considerable personal energy and pronounced marital infidelity, the ver galant of French legend, was stormy and produced 6 children before Henri was assassinated in 1610 by the fanatic François Ravaillac. Leaving Marie as regent for the 9-year-old Louis XIII, Marie's regency and her subsequent political conflict with her son, who came of age and began asserting royal authority in ways that she found incompatible with her continued influence, produced the specific political circumstances from which Cardinal Richelieu emerged as the dominant figure of French politics. Richelieu had initially been Marie's ally and her client. She had promoted his rise to the cardinalate, and was then appropriated by Louis XIII as the instrument of royal authority against the mother who was trying to maintain her regency's influence past its natural expiration. The Day of the Dupe, in November 1630, when Marie convinced herself and convinced Louis that she had succeeded in forcing Richelieu's dismissal, and then discovered within hours that Richelieu had Louis's continued confidence, and that it was she who was being dismissed rather than her protégé, is one of the most dramatically compressed reversals in the political history of the French court, and the moment that ended Marie's practical political influence. She lived another 12 years, in exile in Brussels and then in Cologne, dying in 1642 in a house she could barely afford, attended by Rubens, the painter she had commissioned to celebrate her life in the enormous allegorical cycle now in the Louvre, who himself died the same year. The transformation accelerated when Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, Lorenzo il Magnifico's second son, who'd been made a cardinal at the age of 13 through a transaction whose cost in bribes and political manoeuvring Lorenzo had managed with characteristic effectiveness, was elected Pope Leo X in March 1513. The election of a Medici pope was the moment of maximum Medici power. A family that had informally governed Florence was now formally governing the church, and the combination of Florentine political influence and Roman religious authority was a concentration of power that had no precedent in the family's history and would never be matched again. Leo X was a man who shared his father's love of art and learning and lacked his father's political judgment and his grandfather's financial prudence. He spent money with the abandon of a man who had grown up in a palazzo whose patronage budget was essentially unlimited, and who had never personally managed the consequences of financial overextension. He commissioned Raphael to paint the papal apartments and to design the new St. Peter's Basilica. He commissioned Michelangelo for various projects. He threw magnificent parties and supported humanist scholars and generally presided over a papal court that was the most brilliant in Rome since the days of Julius II, while simultaneously depleting the papal treasury at a rate that would eventually force his successors to the specific financial expedient, the aggressive sale of indulgences in Germany, that triggered Martin Luther's protest in 1517 and began the Protestant Reformation. The connection between Medici financial extravagance and the Protestant Reformation is not a causal simplification, but a genuine historical chain. The funding of the new St. Peter's Basilica required money that the papacy did not have in liquid form, and the sale of indulgences organised by Johann Tetzel in Germany, whose proceeds were divided between the papacy and the Archbishop of Mainz, who had borrowed money from the Fugger banking house of Augsburg to purchase his archbishopric, was the specific financial mechanism that Luther attacked in his 95 Theses. The Fuggers are a reminder that the Medici, for all their dominance of European banking in the 15th century, were not without rivals. The Fugger family of Augsburg, who rose to European financial prominence in the late 15th century, and who funded the Habsburg dynasty's political ambitions with a scale of capital that eventually exceeded anything the Medici could provide, were the commercial successors to Medici dominance in European finance, a passing of the torch that happened gradually through the Medici Bank's organisational deterioration in the last decades of the 15th century, and that was confirmed when the bank effectively ceased to function as a major financial institution after the Second Medici exile of 1494. Leo X died in 1521, leaving the papacy and the unresolved problem of Luther's reform movement to his cousin Giulio, who was elected Pope Clement VII in 1523, and who presided over the most catastrophic single event of the Italian Renaissance, the sack of Rome in 1527. Clement VII's foreign policy had the particular quality of papal foreign policy in the 16th century. The attempt to maintain the papacy's independence between the dominant powers of France and the Habsburg Empire through a combination of alliance, neutrality, and diplomatic manoeuvring that was generally outmatched by the military realities of the Italian wars. His decision to join the League of Cognac against the Emperor Charles V in 1526 led directly to Charles's German and Spanish troops marching on Rome, which they sacked with a thoroughness and a duration. The sack lasted for months, with troops quartered in churches and palaces, works of art destroyed, clergy humiliated, the archives of the Curia pillaged, that caused a trauma in Roman cultural and intellectual life from which recovery took a generation. Clement VII himself spent 7 months imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo, watching the city he was supposed to govern being systematically destroyed by troops nominally serving the Catholic emperor who was supposedly his protector. Florence, meanwhile, had again expelled the Medici in 1527, taking advantage of the chaos of the sack of Rome to restore the Republic in a third iteration. This Third Republic was shorter than the first two, and ended in the same way as the second, military force organised by Medici allies, in this case the armies of Pope Clement VII himself, who had reconciled with the emperor and used the reconciliation to obtain military assistance for the reconquest of Florence. The Siege of Florence in 1529 to 1530, in which the restored Republic held out for 11 months against the combined papal and imperial forces, was one of the great episodes of Florentine civic resistance, and also one of the last. because when the city finally fell, the political settlement that followed was no longer the informal Medici dominance of the 15th century, but the explicit establishment of hereditary rule. Alessandro de' Medici, who was installed as ruler of Florence after the siege ended, was given the title Duke of Florence in 1532, the first explicitly monarchical title in the city's history, ending the fiction of republican governance that the Medici had maintained since the time of Cosimo il Vecchio. Alessandro was a young man of disputed parentage. His mother was a servant of African origin, which made him the only black head of state in European Renaissance history, a fact that his contemporaries noted and that his portrait by Giorgio Vasari preserves in the darkness of his complexion and the specific features that distinguish him from other Medici portraits. And he was a ruler of violent and arbitrary temperament whose governance combined political repression with personal corruption in ways that made him genuinely unpopular, even among those who had accepted the necessity of Medici rule. He was murdered in January 1537 by his cousin Lorenzino de' Medici, in an act of tyrannicide that Lorenzino subsequently wrote about in a self-justifying account that drew on classical examples of virtuous assassination and that had no practical political consequence whatsoever, because Alessandro had been murdered in the middle of the night in Lorenzino's apartment under circumstances that the Florentine population did not immediately know about, and by the time it became public, the other Medici and their Habsburg allies had moved quickly enough to install a successor. Lorenzino fled Florence, spent years in exile in Venice and France, and was eventually murdered in Venice in 1548 by two assassins in Spanish pay, a death that the Medici, who did not forgive or forget, had been patient enough to organize more than a decade after the killing they were avenging. The successor to Alessandro was Cosimo I de' Medici, not a close member of the main Medici line, but a descendant of Lorenzo, the younger brother of Cosimo il Vecchio, drawn from a cadet branch of the family that had maintained itself quietly in the background of Florentine politics, while the main line alternately flourished and was expelled. He was 17 years old when Alessandro was killed, and the Florentine oligarchs who engineered his installation as the new duke thought they were installing a controllable young man who would defer to their guidance. They were wrong about this in a way that would become apparent within a few years. Cosimo I was the most systematically capable ruler the Medici produced after Cosimo il Vecchio, and in some respects he was more capable than his ancestor, because the political world he operated in was more clearly understood and required less of the careful concealment that the earlier Cosimo's republican context had demanded. He was not trying to maintain the fiction of citizen governance. He was a prince, and he governed as one, with the combination of administrative rigour, diplomatic intelligence, and calculated ruthlessness that effective 16th century princehood required. He defeated a Florentine exile army at the Battle of Montemurlo in 1537, eliminating the most immediate military threat to his position. He established the administrative institutions of a modern state, the Medici Guardaroba, which managed the court and its finances, the Otto di Pratica, which handled foreign affairs, the new system of provincial administration that brought the Florentine territory under central control more thoroughly than any previous government had managed. He negotiated the purchase of the city of Siena from the Emperor Charles V in 1557, adding its territory to the Florentine state and establishing the geographic foundation of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany that the papacy would formally create in 1569. The title of Grand Duke of Tuscany, which Pope Pius V conferred on Cosimo I in 1569, was the formal recognition of what Cosimo had been building for 30 years, a regional Italian state of the second rank, capable of maintaining its independence against the dominant powers of France and Spain through a combination of diplomatic skill, financial management, and military self-sufficiency. Cosimo I moved the Medici court from the Palazzo Medici to the Palazzo della Signoria, the old seat of Florentine Republican government, and then to the newly purchased Palazzo Pitti across the Arno, which he expanded into the largest palace in Florence and connected to the Uffizi, his new administrative building, by the Corridoio Vasariano, the elevated corridor designed by Giorgio Vasari that allowed the Grand Duke to move between his residences and his offices without descending to street level, without mixing with the population, as if the city itself had been reorganized around the convenience and the safety of its ruler. The Corridoio Vasariano runs over the Ponte Vecchio, its windows overlooking the goldsmiths' shops that Cosimo had installed on the bridge, and it is one of the most visible physical expressions of Medici power in the landscape of Florence today. Cosimo I also established the Uffizi Gallery as a repository for the Medici art collection, transforming what had been a private family collection into something approaching a public institution. The arrangement that his son Francesco I would formalize, and that would eventually make the Uffizi the museum that it is. The decision to concentrate the collection and make it accessible to approved visitors was part of the cultural program of the Medici court, an assertion that the family's artistic heritage was a civic heritage, that the patronage of Cosimo il Vecchio and Lorenzo il Magnifico had produced not merely private treasures, but the cultural patrimony of Tuscany. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany that Cosimo I established continued under his successors in a trajectory that moved steadily from the creative energy of the early Medici toward the ceremonial and administrative consolidation of a regional court that had accepted its position in the European state system and was managing it with competence, if not with the electric originality of the earlier centuries. Francesco I, who succeeded his father in 1574, was a man of scientific and alchemical interests. He established the Studiolo in the Palazzo Vecchio, a small cabinet of curiosities and scientific instruments that expressed the period's characteristic mixture of Renaissance humanism and proto-scientific investigation, who spent much of his reign in the company of his beloved Bianca Capello, a Venetian woman whom he had taken as a mistress and eventually married after the death of his first wife, with a public disregard for dynastic convention that the Habsburg family of his first wife found insulting. He and Bianca died within hours of each other in October 1587, under circumstances sufficiently suspicious that the subsequent tradition attributed their deaths to poison, arranged by his brother Ferdinando, who succeeded him. Ferdinando I was the more politically capable of the two brothers and the better administrator, and his reign from 1587 to 1609 saw the Grand Duchy managed with a competence that stabilized the state and maintained Tuscany's position in the complex diplomacy of late 16th and early 17th century Italy. He abandoned the cardinal's hat that had protected him in Rome while his brother was alive, married Christine of Lorraine in 1589 in festivities so elaborate that they included the first documented opera, the musical form that the Medici court's Camerata, a group of intellectuals interested in the music of classical antiquity, had recently invented and governed with the combination of financial prudence and diplomatic skill that the Grand Duchy's situation required. The early 17th century under Cosimo II, and then the long regency of his widow Maria Maddalena of Austria, and his mother Christine of Lorraine, who governed jointly on behalf of the young Ferdinando II from 1621 to 1628, was a period of institutional consolidation and cultural patronage that produced, among other things, the Medici court's relationship with Galileo Galilei, the most important scientist of the period. Galileo had been a protégé of the Medici court since 1610, when he dedicated his starry messenger to Cosimo II, and named the four moons of Jupiter that he had discovered the Medici stars, an act of patronage calculation as transparent as it was effective. The Medici court's support for Galileo, providing him with an honorific court position at Florence, maintaining his connection to the cultural world of the Tuscan elite, continued even after the Roman Inquisition's trial of 1633, when Galileo was condemned for his heliocentric cosmology and placed under house arrest at his villa at Arcetri outside Florence. The Inquisition's reach into Tuscany was moderated by the Grand Duchy's independence, and Galileo spent his years under house arrest in conditions that the support of the Medici court made considerably more comfortable than Rome's ecclesiastical authorities might have preferred. Ferdinando II, who ruled from 1628 to 1670, was a gentle and cultivated man whose personal qualities were admirable and whose political effectiveness was limited by the structural constraints of Tuscany's position in 17th century Italy. Squeezed between Spain and France in the ongoing conflicts of the period, financially strained by the economic decline of the Mediterranean trade that had been Tuscany's commercial foundation, unable to project the kind of independent political agency that the earlier Medici had maintained. His court was still culturally significant. The opera performances at the Palazzo Pitti, the continuation of the scientific academy that had grown from the Galileo circle, the maintenance of the art collection, but the energy was that of conservation and management rather than creation. The decline that was already visible in Ferdinando II's reign became more acute under his son Cosimo III, who ruled from 1670 to 1723 in the longest reign in Medici history, and the one most historians find the least inspiring. Cosimo III was a man of intense and narrow Catholic piety who combined genuine personal religious devotion with a governance style that his contemporaries found oppressive. Harsh laws against blasphemy, sodomy, and various other moral offences, expulsions of Jews from some Tuscan cities, a general atmosphere of religious rigidity that contrasted sharply with the humanist openness of the earlier Medici culture. His marriage to the French Princess Marguerite Louise d'Orléans was one of the more spectacular conjugal disasters in the Medici family's history of complicated marriages. The princess loathed Florence, loathed her husband, and eventually obtained permission to return to France, where she lived in a convent for the remainder of her life, while maintaining a correspondence with her son that combined maternal interest with a comprehensive contempt for everything Tuscan. Cosimo III's political preoccupation was the succession, because the legitimate Medici line was failing. His eldest son, Ferdinando, a man of genuine cultural sophistication, a passionate collector of musical instruments and a musician himself, who had developed a close relationship with the Venetian artist Sebastiano Ricci, and who continued the Medici patronage tradition with genuine personal investment, died in 1713 of the syphilis that had been compromising his health for years without legitimate children. His younger brother Giangaston was the last remaining male heir, and Giangaston's marriage to the Bohemian princess Anna Maria Francisca had produced no children and had effectively dissolved into mutual hostility within a few years, with the princess refusing to leave her Bohemian estate and Giangaston refusing to stay there. Cosimo III spent years negotiating with the great powers of Europe about the succession to Tuscany, proposing and discarding various arrangements that would keep Tuscany independent and in Medici hands beyond the current generation, schemes that involved adoption, creative interpretations of dynastic law, the invention of new legal mechanisms for the transfer of sovereignty, none of which was acceptable to the European powers who would eventually decide the question. He died in 1723, having outlived both his sons in practical terms and having failed to resolve the succession he had spent decades worrying about. The Anna Maria Luisa, whose patto di familia secured the Medici collections for Florence, deserves more than the brief appearance she makes in most accounts of the dynasty's end, because she was the most capable figure of the final Medici generation, and her achievement in securing the collections was, in the circumstances, remarkable. She had been born in 1667, the daughter of Cosimo III and Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, and had been married in 1691 to Johann Wilhelm, Elector Palatine, at whose court in Dusseldorf she spent 20 years building one of the finest art collections in the Holy Roman Empire. When Johann Wilhelm died in 1716, leaving no children, she returned to Florence with her personal collection, adding it to the Medici holding she found there, and spent the remaining 27 years of her life as the last surviving Medici of her generation, watching her father and then her brothers die without resolving the succession question. Her negotiations with the incoming Lorraine government in 1737, conducted with the precise legal intelligence of a woman who had spent decades in the sophisticated diplomatic culture of a major German court, produced the patto di familia that transferred all the Medici properties, art, collections and cultural assets to the perpetual possession of the Florentine state, with the specific condition that nothing could be removed from Florence, and that the collections would be maintained for the benefit of the public and of foreign nations who came to study them. This was not a transaction of sentiment, but of calculated permanent endowment. The recognition by the last Medici that the political sovereignty was lost, but the cultural sovereignty was negotiable, and that the price of accepting the one loss was establishing the other in terms that law and treaty could enforce. She survived her brother Giangaston by 4 years, dying in February 1743 at the age of 75, the last of her line, the person whose specific legal intelligence had secured the Uffizi and its contents for the world. The irony that the greatest cultural legacy of a family famous for its male patrons was secured by a woman whose political and legal acumen exceeded anything the later male line produced is the kind of historical irony that is too well documented to be disputed and too rarely acknowledged to have received its proper weight. Giangaston, who succeeded his father in 1723 as the last Medici Grand Duke, was in certain respects the most sympathetic of the later Medici, and the least equipped for the position he occupied. He was a man of genuine intellectual culture, a linguist, a scholar of some ability, deeply unhappy in his personal life, increasingly attached to a circle of young men, the Ruspanti they were called, from the word for ruffians or scoundrels, whose company he preferred to the ceremonial demands of his court. He spent much of his reign in bed, conducting audiences from his bedroom in a state of dishevelment that the Florentine population found alternately pitiful and amusing, emerging occasionally to be paraded through the city in his carriage for the purpose of demonstrating that he was still alive. He was not a tyrant, and he was not incompetent in the basic administrative sense. His government maintained the institutions of the Grand Duchy with reasonable efficiency, but he had neither the will nor the capacity to alter the outcome that the great powers had already decided. The Treaty of Vienna in 1738, which settled the War of the Polish Succession, assigned Tuscany to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, the husband of Maria Theresa of Austria, the Habsburg Empress whose dominance of Central European politics would define the mid-18th century. The deal was the European powers' solution to the Medici succession problem. Tuscany would pass to the Lorraine family, which would thereby compensate Francis Stephen for the loss of his native Lorraine to France, which was part of the same European settlement. The Medici's 3 centuries of Florentine sovereignty were being traded in a chancellery in Vienna as a piece in a larger European dynastic puzzle. Giangaston accepted the arrangement with the exhausted dignity of a man who'd understood for years that this was coming, and had made his peace with it. He was permitted to continue as Grand Duke in name through the remainder of his life, under the nominal governance of a Lorraine administrator. His sister Anna Maria Luisa, the Electress Palatine, the last surviving Medici of the main line, a woman of considerable character who had outlived her husband and her brothers, and who had spent her widowhood in Florence, managing the family's remaining affairs with the practical intelligence that the Medici women often displayed when they were given the opportunity to display anything, negotiated with the incoming Lorraine government, the agreement that preserved the Medici's most lasting legacy. The Patto di Famiglia, the family pact of 1737, stipulated that the Medici art collections, everything in the Uffizi, everything in the Palazzo Pitti, the antiquities and the coins and the manuscripts and the jewels and the scientific instruments, should remain in Florence forever and could not be removed from the city or the Grand Duchy. In exchange for accepting the loss of political sovereignty, Anna Maria Luisa secured the cultural sovereignty of the city that the Medici had shaped. Giangaston de' Medici died on July 9, 1743. He was the last Medici Grand Duke, the last representative of the male line of a family that had moved from the wool trade to the banking house to the informal governance of Florence, to the explicit sovereignty of a Renaissance state across 3.5 centuries. With his death, the Medici dynasty as a political and familial force was over. But the Uffizi was still in Florence, the Botticellis were still in Florence, the Donatellos were still in Florence, the Michelangelos were still in Florence. The manuscripts that Cosimo il Vecchio had collected, and the philosophical tradition that he had subsidized, and the architectural monuments that his money had built, the Palazzo Medici, the rebuilt San Lorenzo, the library at San Marco, were still in Florence. Anna Maria Luisa's Patto di Famiglia had secured, in the absence of political succession, something more durable. The confirmation that what the Medici had built would remain in the city where they had built it, for as long as the city stood. The Medici Bank, which had been the foundation on which everything else rested, had ceased to function as a significant financial institution well before the dynasty's political end. Its decline in the last decades of the 15th century was the product of multiple simultaneous pressures: the bad loans of Tommaso Portinari in Bruges, the political disruptions of the Italian wars that damaged the commercial networks on which the bank's operations depended, the failure of the later Medici to provide the management attention and the capital injection that the bank needed to adapt to the changing financial environment, and the specific fiscal demands of Medici political rule that caused the family to treat the bank's deposits as a personal treasury available for political expenditure, rather than as clients' funds held in trust. This last failing, the use of depositors' money to fund the political projects of the Medici family, was perhaps the most structurally damaging, because it violated the implicit contract between the bank and its clients, on which the bank's reputation and therefore its business depended. The Medici Bank in its final decades was doing with other people's money what Giovanni de' Bicci had specifically warned against, and the consequences were as predictable as the old man's warning had implied they would be. The bank effectively collapsed during the Second Medici exile after 1494, when the Florentine Republic confiscated the family's Florentine assets and the branch network, without the headquarters and the family's personal authority to hold it together, dissolved into its component partnerships, and then dissolved further into insolvency. The banking tradition that the Medici had embodied and elevated did not die with the Medici Bank. The practices of double-entry bookkeeping, the letter of exchange, the branch banking network, the diversified portfolio of clients and geographies, These were already part of the general inheritance of European commercial culture by the time the Medici Bank failed, absorbed into the practice of the Fuggers and the Genoese bankers and the Amsterdam exchange houses that would carry European financial sophistication into the 17th century and beyond. What died with the Medici Bank was something harder to quantify than a set of financial instruments. The specific combination of cultural ambition and financial power and political intelligence that had made the bank not merely a commercial institution, but a cultural force, the thing that commissioned the Primavera and funded the Platonic Academy, and paid for the dome of the Florence Cathedral, and made possible, in ways both direct and indirect, most of what the word Renaissance has meant for the 5 centuries since. 3 cents an acre, historians estimate the cost of the Louisiana Purchase. There is no easy metric for what the Medici Bank's operations cost and what they produced. No exchange rate between 15th century Florentine florins and the cultural value of the birth of Venus, or the philosophical legacy of Ficino's Platonic Academy, or the architectural achievement of Brunelleschi's dome. But the ledger, if you could construct it, would show on the credit side something that no other family in any other century in any other city quite managed to produce. The most concentrated explosion of human creative achievement in the history of Western civilization, sustained across a century by the specific attention and the specific resources of a family that understood, with unusual clarity, that beauty and power and money and knowledge were not separate categories but different expressions of the same thing, and that the greatest investment any wealthy family could make was in the capacity of human beings to make things that had never existed before. The night has settled in fully now, and the long story of the Medici has reached its quiet end. Not the dramatic end of conspiracy and assassination that punctuated the middle of the story, but the gentle, inevitable end of a dynasty that ran out of heirs in an 18th century bedchamber in the Palazzo Pitti, the last Grand Duke lying in the room where his ancestors had governed and patronized and plotted and survived, while outside the windows the city that his family had made continued to be exactly what they had made it. Florence is still there. The Palazzo Medici is still on the Via Larga, which is now the Via Cavour. The dome that Brunelleschi built is still rising above the cathedral, still the largest masonry dome in the world, still the physical statement of 15th century Florentine ambition that Cosimo de' Medici funded and oversaw. The David is still in Florence, in the Accademia Gallery, the bronze one and the marble one both. The Donatello that stood in the Medici courtyard, and the Michelangelo that the Republic commissioned, and that the young sculptor shaped in the specific philosophical and artistic climate that the Medici had created. The birth of Venus is in the Uffizi, where it has been since Anna Maria Luisa gave it to the city forever. The Medici made all of this possible, not alone. The artists who made the art were the artists, and the scholars who developed the ideas were the scholars, and the Florence that generated the culture was a city of hundreds of thousands of people, whose labour and whose civic energy, and whose specific quality of competitive communal pride in their city's achievements were not reducible to any single family's patronage. But the Medici were the axis around which the whole thing turned, the family whose specific choices about where to put their money and their attention and their intelligence made the specific things that happened happen rather than not happening, in the specific place and the specific time that they happened. The ledger is closed. The last Grand Duke is at rest. The paintings are on the walls, exactly where Anna Maria Luisa said they would stay. The Arno moves through the city that the Medici loved and spent themselves on, dark and steady, under the bridge where the Corridoio Vasariano still runs above the goldsmiths' shops, connecting the palaces that no longer house the family that built them to each other, as if waiting for the family to come back. They will not come back. The story is over. But what they built is still there, and that was always the better part of the bargain. Rest easy.